Check 1, 2, testing 1, 2. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore on this frigid evening. Thanks for coming out. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the Scholar. Tonight is our very first author event of 2024, and we couldn't be happier to be hosting Jon Clinch alongside our friends at the National Civil War Museum. Before we begin, I have some quick housekeeping to go over, as always. One, like I said, this is our very first event of 2024, and we've announced many more authors scheduled into the new year, including Dr. Alan Gelzo in February, who's written a new book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. Stay tuned to our website and e-newsletter for updates on upcoming author events, and don't forget to take a flyer on your way out. Two, we have copies of The General and Julia available for purchase tonight at the cafe, and Jon is graciously sticking around for a book signing after the event. A quick reminder that book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our author event series, and each purchase helps support the bookstore, the authors, and the future of our programming. Three, last, I'd like to give a special shout out to Jeffrey Nichols and the National Civil War Museum for coming on board as partners for this event. As many of you know, the museum is one of the largest museums in the world dedicated solely to the American Civil War. They're located right here in Harrisburg, and they have rotating exhibits, upcoming events, and educational opportunities to learn more about the Civil War. Visit their website for more information, or I'm sure you can chat with Jeffrey after the event. But at this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers here this evening. Our featured author is Jon Clinch. Jon is the author of the acclaimed novels Finn, Kings of the Earth, The Thief of Auschwitz, Belzani Dreams of Egypt, Marley, and The General and Julia. A native of upstate New York, Jon lives with his wife in the Green Mountains of Vermont. Our moderator this evening is Jeffrey L. Nichols. Jeffrey is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Civil War Museum. Prior to joining the museum, he was the Executive Director of Georgetown Heritage, a philanthropic partner of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. And before that, he was the President and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, Thomas Jefferson's Retreat House and Plantation, located near Lynchburg, Virginia. He also worked at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, in several roles, serving as executive director for the final 4 years of his tenure there. Of course, tonight, Jon's new novel is titled The General and Julia. I have to read this one blurb from Elizabeth Letts, who writes that Clinch's novel is, quote, a love story, a compelling piece of American history, a page-turner with a star-studded cast of characters. Not since All the Light We Cannot See have I read such a perfect example of what historical fiction should be, end quote. We're very honored to host Jon Clinch and Jeffrey Nichols, so without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for coming out on this cold day. It's good that we have more people here than the temperature outside, so thank you.
I was hoping for a hotter day.
Yeah, we all were, but
like it's 80, then we get 85 people.
That's true.
Yeah.
But here we are.
Oh well.
So again, thank you. Jon and I go kind of way back.
We do.
Back to the Mark Twain House days. Jon's first book was called Finn, which was based upon Mark Twain's famous Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Pap Finn, who was Huck Finn's father.
Yep.
And we did a program probably similar to this one back in Hartford all those years ago. And so when this book appeared with Grant and Julia, or The General and Julia, it was obviously a no-brainer. I think you reached out to me first.
I did reach out to Jeff first, and I was, well, you never know. But it turns out that Jeff was kind enough to agree to come here tonight and get together with all of you and me.
So with that, tell us a little bit about yourself, Jon. When did you become an author, or what have you been working on?
I started out in advertising, the devil's work, and worked with my wife for many years in advertising. We had a little shop in the Philadelphia suburbs. I decided that I was going to start writing novels probably in the year, I would say, 1997 maybe. My daughter was starting high school. My wife and I worked for ourselves in the house, and I found out that when my daughter Emily was leaving for school early in the day, I would start work earlier in the day doing that annoying advertising stuff. So I decided, wait a minute, I need to spend that first hour doing something else, doing the thing that I always thought I might be able to do, which was writing a novel. I figured out that if I wrote one page, remember pages? It was digital, but I would write a page a day, 250 words, and after a year, I should have a book, something like a book, 100,000 words. And I gave it a shot, and my idea every day was to write enough and to write it well enough so that I could read it aloud to my wife when she came down to begin her workday. And I wrote 5 novels before I was able to interest a literary agent in so much as a single one of them. I should have learned through that process something about commerce, but I failed to. And here we are today. So it's a thing I've always done, I've always written, and this is just a different kind of writing, and it's a kind that I think suits me a little better.
So tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book on the General and Julia. And it's your first real historical novel as well.
It is.
Historical fiction.
I've done historical fiction of a sort before, that is to say fiction set a long while ago. First novel, Finn, as Jeff said, set in really probably about 1840, 1845, before the Civil War. And people seem to think I did all right with that material, so it seemed to me like a good idea to keep in mind ideas that might arise that would set me in the same kind of a direction. I've always written about terrible people. I've always written about the worst and the ugliest and the awfulest. Finn is soaked in blood, alcohol, misogyny, and racism.
You just described Pap Finn.
Yeah, which describes Pat Finn, so there you go. And therefore, when I read Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses Grant, the thing that stuck with me was not the heroism and not the leadership that he showed during the Civil War or afterward. It was the heroism that he showed during the last year, specifically the last month of his life, when he had no money. He had very little public reputation. He had no health. He was dying of cancer, and he threw himself into writing his memoirs in order to leave something behind for his wife and children. And to me, that was the most heroic aspect of his life, and I loved it, and it inspired me.
Yeah, it's interesting you picked up on that. I think a lot of historians feel the same way, that other than his war service, that was the pinnacle of his life,
Yes.
being able to do that. We'll get more into that a little bit later.
Yeah, it was the pinnacle, and it was the lowest point. And you
Absolutely.
can often find out, as a writer, one way to explore a character is to see that character at his worst, at his lowest point. And I don't think you can get any lower than he was at that moment.
And our friend Mark Twain will make an appearance later in this conversation
will.
as well. So, sticking to the book, just having read through it and seen it, it's basically in chronological order, but you also put in these chapters in between called 40 Days and 40 Nights. Can you explain why you did that and what those are?
Yeah, I have a history of writing things that are kind of complicated. I think that's a fair statement. Finn is a novel that exists in a narrative structure that's only comprehensible by a drunk. And and it's a challenge for the non-drunk reader to try to find his way through. I've learned to be a little more straightforward, and as you say, the main arc of the General and Julia begins when Ulysses and Julia are quite young, and they're courting, and it ends with his death and her. Actually, there's a coda with her after his death. But in between those, and it doesn't tell anybody's whole life story. It tells small vignettes that I found important and that I thought added up to something. And in between each of those vignettes, there is a chapter, a sub-chapter, a little sliver called 40 Days and 40 Nights, which was pretty much the amount of time that he spent in a borrowed cottage on Mount McGregor in the Adirondacks at the end of his life, where he was dying and he was writing. So those last 40 days are all represented in little. It's like a 20-layer cake, and the 40 days and 40 nights bits are the frosting in between the orderly stuff. And because he was so ill, because he was being medicated in the most preposterous, we think now, ways, he might be having a spell in the morning and get injected with laudanum mixed with cocaine and brandy. Not a good way to work actively on your memoirs, I shouldn't think. And so I took it upon myself to be able to say, look, I can get inside his brain during those moments. I can step into him in a way that I couldn't, pardon me, if he were entirely himself. I can follow him in hallucinations. I can watch as he conflates the past and the present, as he misremembers, as he remembers. So those are all in the interstitial spaces, while the novel itself takes a more direct route on the outside.
So you mentioned the early chapters. You really start around 1843. I think it's actually named one of the chapters. And you talk about Julia Dent meeting Ulysses S. Grant, who they would be married for the next 40-odd years.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about who Julia Dent was? We're some familiar with, obviously, Grant, but his wife maybe not so much.
I'm an old man, and I watch Jeopardy, by the way. And about 3 weeks ago, Julia Dent was a question or an answer? I don't know. How does that work? She was the second part. I guess that means she was the question. So that's one thing. I mean, if you'd read The General and Julia before that, you could have been very wealthy. But at any rate, she was the daughter of a planter, of a farmer and a keeper of a plantation in Missouri, and he was a slaver. He had, from what we know, at least 30, 40 slaves on his property. And that was quite the contrast with the world that Ulysses Grant came from. His father was an abolitionist, a staunch abolitionist, and the two of them fell in love. And from then on, there were tensions that pushed and pulled in all those directions. Julia, until the close of the Civil War, had a slave woman who belonged actually to her father and was assigned to tend to her. So here she was, traveling around the country at war, staying in tents and cabins and cottages and houses all around the theaters of war, with her husband Ulysses, who was fighting for abolition, the getting rid of slavery, with her slave woman along with her. So that certainly posed some questions that were asked quite often, and that I had to resolve in the book.
They were, and Grant actually had a slave too, a person that he manumitted, freed just before the war. So it was also given to him essentially.
Yeah.
And he really didn't want to own someone else, so he did do that. And as you said, she had that enslaved person. She claimed, we're doing a little follow-up research, that she freed this individual. Was it Julia?
Yeah, I think she did. Yeah, it was Julia, and the slave woman was named Jewel. Her name was also Julia. They shortened her name. I think the book says something like, her name was truncated in a cruel way in the interest of convenience, which you could understand, and which is a terrible thing.
And she apparently said she was freed on January 1st, 1863, which is when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. But in reality, it wasn't until the 13th Amendment at the end of the war that she really gained her freedom. So you talk about, again, you go through their life, and it was really a hard life leading up to the Civil War.
Yeah, we were just talking about this earlier. Jeff mentioned the name of the place where Grant and his wife, General and Julia, lived, and they lived there for quite a while. It was on a piece of property owned by her father, and it was a cabin that they built themselves, and they called it Hardscrabble, and that's exactly what it was. It was a Hardscrabble life.
It was. In fact, it was such poverty at some point that Grant actually had to sell firewood. He even pawned a watch, which you share that story, which is an actual story
Yeah,
of him pawning his watch.
exactly. In fact, this is sort of an interesting idea of how books like this get written. And most of this book, except for the dramatic parts, the dramatized sequences, conversation, and so forth. Aside from that stuff, essentially everything with the exception of one segment that I can think of, and I won't tell you what it is, really happened. I mean, it's all based on the real stuff. But I had persuaded myself that I had made up, because I wrote the book a couple of years ago. A few months ago, I persuaded myself that I had made up the sequence where he sells his watch in order to buy Christmas gifts for his children and his wife. And I was kind of kicking myself, thinking, well, that was the hokiest thing I could have come up with. It's like an O. Henry story. I thought, why? What was I thinking? And then a friend of mine sent me a clipping from somewhere of the story where it actually happened. And then I remembered, oh, I didn't make that stuff up. So there you go. Yeah, things are rough. Things are rough. He had a watch. He pawned it for $22, $23, something like that. Not an easy life.
And then you go into the war years. We've talked about that a little bit. The main thing you focus on, it seems, is Julia and the enslaved person. But there's also something you obviously want to share with us from that section.
There might
please.
be.
Yeah.
There might be. I think of this book, pardon me, I think of it as a love story, but not a romance. It's a love story between a man and a woman, and a love story between a man and his country, between a man actually who loved other soldiers, between a man who loved his children, a man who loved other people that he knew and did not know, people of different colors from himself. And he not only had this affection that was outgoing, outward directed, but there was a lot of affection directed toward him. After his presidency, he was probably the most famous man on the planet. He could go anywhere in the world and be welcomed, and usually a parade would break out. That was how important and how beloved he was. But here's an example. But he never took it too seriously. He never made himself large. And here's an example. This is a story that really happened. He says his farewells to Julia and the children. And he goes by steamboat from St. Louis to Cairo. And once in Cairo, he boards a train for the 2-day journey to Chattanooga. Everyone knows him, but no one recognizes him. For he travels, as always, in his natural, anonymous state. If he weren't a general, he could be a spy. So unremarkable is his native condition. For one thing, he is smaller than his reputation. Smaller and less ornamented and easier to miss. Slouched in his seat and barreling toward Nashville in the gathering twilight, he is clad as unprepossessingly as any rough-knuckled tradesman. He wears cotton trousers of faded blue and a pale, checked gray shirt minus a collar. His featureless blue overcoat is folded and stowed on the seat to his right. Atop his head is a cap of white wool, knitted for him by his daughter, Nellie, as a Christmas present, drawn down close to his eyebrows. He bears, in other words, no indication of his line of work, much less his rank. Only the grim set of his jaw might indicate that there is reason to pay him particular mind. The set of his jaw and the sparkle of his eyes as blue as the skies of his native Ohio, eyes as blue as his lonesome, traveling heart. Shouts rouse him up. Shouts and a shuddering of the train as it slows. He opens his eyes and straightens his back. As the train enters a long bend, he sees through the window a line of bonfires set like gemstones along the track. The sun has nearly set and the stars are coming out. The fires reflect in the glossy black sides of the passenger cars, doubling themselves again and again as the train flickers past. He sees men tending the fires, and he wonders what might have brought them here, where they've come from, what their intentions might be. A porter comes through to light the lamps, and by the low bloom of their glow, he catches sight of his ghost in the window pane, white cap and wrinkled shirt and all. He snatches off the cap and rakes his fingers through his hair, making himself a shade more presentable. The act brings his face closer to the window, and the firelight illuminates his features from without, and a roar goes up from beyond the glass. The men along the tracks are soldiers. He sees that now. Some in uniform and some in partial uniform and some not in uniform at all. But they're soldiers, everyone, Union soldiers, his soldiers. They wave their hats and they shout his name and they bellow into the night like the hog collars that some of them would still be were it not for this damned war. Such cheering and hallooing you have never witnessed. For moments like this are reserved for very particular individuals. They're not meant for the common run. And whether you are the one being cheered or a member of the cheering throng, you will never forget it as long as you live. 80 years into the future, men now barely past the age of consent will be telling stories of this night to their great-grandchildren. How word got out that General Grant would be on this train. How every available man came from all over Tennessee. How they not only saw the general with their own eyes, but were actually seen by him in return. Grant smiles down on them in spite of himself, and they respond in kind, their upturned faces gleaming in the light. Some of them snap to attention and offer a salute, which the general returns, despite his dishevelment. To do less would be an act of disrespect. The train moves on, and Grant draws his cheek up against the window and peers into the distance ahead. By God, he thinks, they've lighted the tracks all the way to Nashville. So it was, and so it was.
It was indeed, and you mentioned after his 2 terms as president, they go on a world tour, he and Julia, and they come back to the States, and then they have to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives, essentially. And this begins to get to that point in the story where his life takes a turn, and our friend Mark Twain also shows up. But before that, he is approached by his son to become part of a business called Grant and Ward. And this would be something he thought would secure his future and his wife's future, but in fact did just the opposite. So can you tell us who Ferdinand Ward was?
Ferdinand Ward was known among the people that knew him and talked about him and referred to him and invested money with him and lost all their money to him as the young Napoleon of Wall Street. And he was a young man of no known background who suddenly was able to make huge amounts of money for his investors. He made it in a way that only people like George Ponzi was able to make it, not by making it actually, but by turning dollars around and lying to people. He really invented the Ponzi scheme in some ways 25 years before Charles Ponzi was born. And as a result, he took everything that Grant had. He took everything that Grant's son had. He took everything that everybody Grant knew had, because Grant had been so proud of his son and so happy with the returns he was getting. He had asked everybody he knew, from his poorest grandmother on down, to invest everything they had in Grant and Ward. And it failed. I'm going to read one little thing about the two of them. This is about Ward had a partner. His name was James Fish, and they were a mismatched pair of scoundrels, alike only in their secret, unappeasable lust for money. They took offices directly below the offices on at number 2 Wall Street that Grant occupied. Here we go. And thus do they hang like a pair of spiders in the darkness below Grant's rooms. They are implacable, secretive, patient. They have plans, and they are in no hurry to reveal them. Creatures such as this are always to be found where men gather, weaving pale and sticky threads through the warp and weft of the day-lit world. They are often much nearer to us than we know. One may be right alongside your boot just now. Look sharp or you'll miss it. No matter. It won't have gone far. That was Grant. Those were Ulysses Jr.'s business partners.
Yes, he didn't have the best choice in business partners. You can also think of the Bertie Madoff of Grant's
Madoff,
world.
yep.
That's exactly what it was. And so this leaves him destitute and in significant debt. And in your book, you point out that Julia is pushing him in some ways, even before this happens, to write a memoir.
Yeah.
And can you talk about that in your book?
His friend, William Tecumseh Sherman, Uncle Billy, as he called him, had written a memoir and had done pretty well with it. And Julia had been interested all along in the idea that her husband might write a memoir of his own. She thought that he had valuable insights and that people would be interested and they deserved to read it. He dragged his feet. He ended up writing a few little articles for a magazine, which he really began doing after he lost all his money, because at least it got him a few $100s. And ultimately, with the encouragement and help of Julia and his son, Fred, who, believe it or not, would read everything that his dad wrote and compare it against the printed records, governmental records, and found that he remembered everything in spite of everything that he was undergoing. He began to work on his memoir, and he cut a deal for it. He cut a deal with a publisher who had printed his articles for $500 or $400 a piece or thereabouts. And it was a bad deal. It wasn't the kind of deal that Uncle Billy Sherman had that made him what seemed like a lot of money to a person like Ulysses Grant, who had none. And at the very last minute, his friend Samuel Clemens arrived and knocked on the door. And because actually Clemens had heard this publisher, nobody knew that he was going to do this. Clemens had heard that his publisher, he'd been following down the street in a rainstorm, and he heard the guy talking about how Grant was going to write his memoirs and he was going to publish them. So Twain went directly to Grant's house to make sure that he was getting a decent deal, and was totally alarmed that he was getting the worst deal imaginable, which would have been just in keeping with everything else that had happened to the poor guy. Twain came through for him. Twain was a great one for losing money.
He was. But not in this case. He actually, there's a great Twain quote that's, "To succeed in business, avoid my example." But in this case, he actually did really well. And you mentioned the publisher was named Richard Gilder.
Right.
And the magazine was called Century Magazine, which was a common magazine at the time. And Mark Twain was published in that several times.
Yeah.
Including his story. Mark Twain wrote a story on his experience 2 weeks or so, maybe, in the Confederate Army at the beginning of the war.
It didn't stick, did it?
It did not stick. No, fighting wasn't for him. A private history of a campaign that failed, which is all preposterously told. But so he had that published and others. And so when he did go and see Grant, and they were friends, they had met earlier in their lives, but also by this point had known each other. And Twain had another quote that he said, talking about Grant reading this contract proposal to him aloud. He said, Grant, read the draft aloud, and I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. So that's how he felt about it. So he knew what was going on. And Mark Twain also detested his own publishers.
Yeah, he had just started his own publishing house, and they were about to publish The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, was their first book. And the next book, he suggested, ought to be General Grant's memoirs.
Right, and the company he started was called Charles L. Webster and Company, and as he said, was the publisher. And he met with Grant and the family, and they came up with this deal to write the book. And Grant was given a contract by Mark Twain that was very generous. And you write about it in your book. Can you talk a little bit about
enormously generous. And you had some numbers earlier today. But end of the story is that as he was struggling to get this thing written, hoping to make $1 for the family, he finished writing the book, believe it or not, 3 days before he died. The book was published shortly after he died by Twain's house, and it went on to become, at the time, the single best-selling book ever. And Jeff was sharing some numbers with
Yeah,
me
I do have some numbers for you, and that's right. So Grant would spend at least 4 months writing it in Mount McGregor and other places, and finish the book 5 days before he dies. And Grant, and it is published. And I actually have a copy of it. I have some artifacts I brought with me. So when you finish with the book signing, come back over here, and I can show you one of the original copies of the book, as well as a few other things about Grant. But according to Mark Twain, once he had a very creative way of selling this book too. The American Publishing Company was sold by subscription, so you went door to door. And what he did, he created a script that everybody would use, and something called a prospectus, which I also have here copies of, that I can share with you in a little bit. But this little thing that people would carry with them, and he hired Union veterans to go door to door to sell you the book of the great hero of the war. This is what the size of the prospectus was down here. And so this Union soldier, who maybe have a visible wound or not, would come to your house and would sign you up for this 2-volume book. And you could choose from 3 different types of books and 3 different types of bindings. And there's one downstairs, actually.
Yeah,
We saw on the line. And so it was extremely successful. And there were publishers, printing presses operating across the country to produce this book. And according to Mark Twain, and as John knows quite well, Mark Twain could tell a stretcher or two. So you're going to take things with a grain of salt. But basically, he said, the playoff of what John was talking about, that they printed and sold 610,000 single volumes. Remember, it's a 2-volume book. Average of $4 each, using 906 tons of papers. And in the binding, 35,261 sheep, goat, and calf skins. 25 and a quarter miles of cloth, a yard wide. There were 276 barrels, 69,000 pounds of binder paste. And the gold leaf on the backs of the book cost $21,639.50 in 1886, 85, 86 dollars. And so he goes on, and then he talks about, and done, talking about all this being done, it did Mrs. Grant a world of good. The book was issued 14 months ago, and we have thus far paid Mrs. Grant 2 checks for royalties, one for $200,000 and the other for $150,000, and still more is due to her. I put the $150,000 into an inflation calculator. It's about $5 million, and altogether, she was paid somewhere around. It varies by historian to historian, anywhere from $350,000 to $450,000, which comes out to be about 12 or $13 million.
That's a lot of scratch. And it wasn't Confederate money either, was it?
No, it was the good stuff. It was greenbacks, yeah. And I think you talked about at the very beginning that heroic aspect of his life, and this really showed that, because we didn't really talk about what you talked a little bit about what he was suffering, but you have a great chapter called The Peach.
Yeah.
And can you tell how he found out he had cancer and what that meant?
And this is how it happened. The chapter actually begins with a T.S. Eliot reference. Everything went well until he dared to eat a peach. And he was he and his wife were getting through their lives as best they could. They were taking care of themselves in the house that they had in New York City. And he ate a peach, and he swallowed a bit of a peach, and he was sure that that an insect had lodged itself in his throat. The pain was searing, and he had never felt it before, and he was certain that it was so unusual. He thought a spider or a bee or something had somehow found its way into his gut, into his throat, and was stinging him. Turned out that it wasn't that, and when his doctor showed up the next day, it was cancer, and he was in the early stages of throat cancer, which would ultimately, about a year later, kill him. And so he was, which explains why he was under so much medical care, and there's also a sense delivered throughout the novel of why he ended up with throat cancer, of course, that he was a man who, I think Mark Twain must have admired his ability to smoke. And Mark Twain, what was the quote about, it's easy to quit smoking, I know, I've done it 100 times. Yeah. And
would smoke 20 to 30 cigars a day.
Yeah, 20 to 30 cigars a day. So no wonder he was suffering by the end. I think you'd have to stay up all night in order to do that. I don't know.
Mark Twain also wrote that one time he tried to quit smoking, and he said he would only smoke one cigar a day, but he couldn't get any work done because he spent the entire day looking for the biggest cigar he could possibly find. So obviously, as we've already mentioned, as soon as he's finished with the book, really that was all the energy he had left. He dies 5 days later. And his funeral is one of the largest funerals, really, of the 20th century, 19th century.
1.5 million Americans showed up and to throng the streets of New York. It was incredible, and what was the line to pass by the coffin was, I forget how it was above and beyond what anybody would imagine today for the funeral of a figure like him. There was Stonewall Jackson's, a band from Stonewall Jackson's brigade actually showed up and marched in the parade and played in that march. A few of them didn't show because they were still holding a grudge. The rest of them did.
As happened. And you sort of conclude the book a little bit with Julia's last year. She lived another 15 years or so, give or take. And very comfortable means because of what she did with her husband. And if you've ever been in New York City, been to Grant's tomb, you know that's eventually where she is. From your work, just to sort of wrap up our conversation, is there anything that you learned, any other insights to Grant and Julia that you'd like to share with us? Insight
into Grant. This is important today in America right now. So much of this is important today in America right now, which is kind of why I wrote the book anyway. But one of the things that I learned, it's not in the book, which is great. Ulysses Grant was our only sitting president ever to be arrested. And he and some friends, he loved horses. He loved horses above most things. He loved a lot of love in this book, but he loved horses. The wilder, the better. The less broken, the better. And he and some friends of his were out with their carriages and their teams racing down the streets of Washington, D.C. And a policeman spied them, stopped them, a black policeman of all things, and took them all aside and issued a warning that they had better not do this again, president or not. The next day, he caught them again and took them all down to the station. And at the station, Grant paid his $20 fine and politely bowed his head and took his licks and went home, making himself the only sitting president ever arrested. And we might wish that others would be or would have been. But
you said sitting, so
he's the only one we got so far.
Jon, thank you so much for this. I enjoyed the book. It was great getting back together with you. First time we've been in each other's company for 10 years or so, but we appreciate it.
This has been great. Never mind you. Oh, no, just kidding. Thank you so much for coming out. It's so important to us to be able to spend a few minutes with people who have chosen to give us a little bit of their lives. That means so much to us, so thank you for being here, and thanks to Jeff for welcoming me back after all this time. After all, and it was a fun day today. If you haven't been to the museum, you need to go. You need to go. We should open it up right now. We should be like Robin Williams after a show. Just come on, we're all gonna go.
Night at the museum. Let's go.
Night at the museum.
Sounds good. And I agree. Thank you all again. Thank you, Jon. And now we'll take some questions, I believe.
Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with a mic. Yes.
What happened to his children?
You know, I don't know.
They had 4 children.
They had 4 children.
They
three
all
boys,
lived
1 daughter.
past both of them, which is not a common occurrence. And I think they had
See,
12 or 13 grandchildren.
Yeah, with no more information that I have, Jeff did a much better job.
But that's the extent of it. But they were. I think did his son get back on his feet? Do you know after?
I
after
believe
over-
so. Well, probably because the family had come in.
Yeah,
with so much-
$13 million. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks to Dad.
But you can imagine and it was Ulysses Jr. was the son who was responsible for, in some way, who had been tricked into the situation that caused so much trouble. His character was an important one to me because how would you feel, and how would you reconcile that with your family? And his dad, Ulysses, gave the example of trying to rectify everything, trying to bring it all to right. That's a pretty high standard to live up to, I think.
And he did.
And he did.
And it's interesting, as you mentioned, I think there's a question here, but the Bernie Madoff connection. I remember seeing some of the stories of people who encourage their friends and their neighbors to invest with, I say Bernie Sanders? I meant Bernie Madoff.
Not Bernie Sanders.
Not Bernie Sanders.
I'm
Bernie
a
Madoff.
Vermonter.
And
No,
how
don't diss Bernie
they had that same feeling of
Yeah.
just complete and utter and total regret
Yeah.
of having done this to their family friends. So I can imagine
Yeah.
how Buck was his
Yeah.
name, the name he went by, and how Grant felt. But more questions.
John, thank you for coming down all the way from Vermont to Harrisburg. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you for coming here tonight and doing this. I saw this online because I'm on the newsletter, and I immediately had to come down. One of my favorite subjects.
You tell all your friends? No. You told your friend.
I have a question for you. Do you cover in the book how Julia was a support to him, not only during the scandals in the White House, but with the bankruptcy and the embarrassment of having brought all his friends and associates in on it?
Yeah, the the White House years weren't important to me in terms of the story that I needed to tell. So in fact, those years are almost glossed over, except for his meeting with, well, a few things, but his meeting with Mark Twain, his initial meeting with Mark Twain, which Twain remembered very differently from how Grant did, although he may have been making it up.
Stretcher.
Basically, there's a in the aftermath of the loss of everything, before and in the aftermath, there's an important sense in the novel of the two of them sort of against the world. The two of them supporting one another, and Julia going back to the old recipes that Jewel, her slave, had made many years prior. And living a very simple life, and going back to hardscrabble in a way, not physically, but the two of them as a unit, as a pair. It was very important to me to tell that story. Yes, he did. She was his lodestar. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a love affair between the two of them from, I think, the moment they met to the time he passed. And she traveled quite a bit during the Civil War to be with him. It was very few occasions where he was alone.
Yeah.
She tried to get to him wherever he was in the field as time could. So you're absolutely right that need to be with each other was there the entire time.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book, and I did read it. I'm a person, it's not a thick book, but I like to spread it out because it becomes my friend, So anyway, I grew up North Jersey, and my father was a World War II veteran, and he used to say, "Come on, Joni, we're going over to Riverside to Grant's tomb." And I, as a teenager, Dad, very austere in there. And you say in the book that Grant was not really a religious man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my father kind of was. He was in the tank destroyers, and he suffered greatly from battle fatigue, which we became to know as PTSD.
Right.
So I think, he...
First it was shell shock.
Exactly.
Then it was battle fatigue.
Yeah,
Now it's PTSD, and then whatever you call it, it was horrible.
Those tanks were pretty bad. Not that they're good today. But anyway, he... so I just kind of, my father had this strong feeling towards this president, this
Good for
leader of the
him.
union. And one of the things I picked up in your book, and I don't know if you did it deliberately or, as you began to look at this man in his own life, it was your interpretation. But I picked up compassion from your portrayal, not only of, you know, the general and Julia, Ulysses and Julia, but of the man himself. So is that your interpretation, or from historical, do you believe he really was a man that had compassion?
I believe he was I believe. I mean, we only know what we can gather. I'm not an historian. I only work from readily available sources. But it seemed to me, as I looked at his life, as I looked at one decision one act after another, and thought about what the decision-making process might have been, you know, you try to work backwards from what you see happen, and figure out what kind of an individual would make the decision that would cause that to happen. And he seemed again and again to me to be a person who had an enormous compassion. What I didn't get around to, or didn't find a way to do, was the horrible compassion and horrible guilt that he no doubt felt for his part in the carnage. Well, I did to some extent in the northern side that was destroyed and killed. But my belief is that, I mean, I give you the best description of him that I can, based on a sympathetic imagining of extrapolated from what we know. And, you know, maybe I'm a little bit romantic about that. I tend to, as I said, write about horrible people, and this was a breath of fresh air for me, because I fell in love with him as the book went along. I didn't expect to. I expected to respect him, and I expected to appreciate and even admire him. But there's a lot there to care about.
We have time for maybe one more question, two more questions.
Just curious, aside from his writing as a military leader and as a president, was there anything else that he wrote? Because, you know, I mean, here's this memoir that's extremely well written, but he really wasn't a writer.
No, certainly not a writer in terms of training, or a writer in terms of inclination, though, and a writer. You know, he had filed, of course, battle reports every day during the war, so there was a certain amount of writing that went on, which was probably good for his memory, to have written all that stuff down on the battlefield day after day. But there's nothing that I know of other than the memoir.
No, again, his work as a military officer, he's a West Point grad, obviously. And so it was that. And his orders and his reports were very concise and clear, and just like his writing. And the other thing about it is that, of course, he also had an adjutant that was helping him with the book, at least typing and doing other things. But Grant wrote every word.
Well, yeah, I forgot about that guy.
Yeah.
I left him out.
There were accusations that someone else wrote this book, and particularly if you think of the publisher, a fellow named Mark Twain, that over the years that a lot of people said, well, Mark Twain must have had a hand in this. Mark Twain swore up and down he did nothing other than, you know, edit here and there and a few things, but that it was all Grant, and that he did it from memory.
Yeah.
That you write about that in the book, about this prodigious memory that he has. And to be able to recall these facts, and that he had an adjutant who would be looking at the official records and verifying it all. Yeah. So it seems like he had a bit of a natural talent for it. And
he's in those books. He is in the memoirs. They are the recollections of one human being, and they're beautiful. And to the question about compassion, even when he's describing little conflict with another military man, somebody who's done something that he really disapproves of or disagrees with, he's never unkind. He is. You can tell that he's not crazy about this, and that he probably doesn't respect this guy as much as he would like to. But he's unfailingly decent and kind, and his voice and his personality come through there.
This will be our last question.
It's been partially answered, but I was wondering, what was his process in writing at the end? Did he lock himself away and just write and write and write, or did he talk it out loud?
No,
with
he,
some-
he couldn't speak at the end.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, he couldn't speak
So
at all. He was writing with
wrote.
a pen, the stub of a pencil. He communicated with the family only by writing on little slips of paper. So it was just a grind, writing this thing out, getting it down one day after the next. And his memory of these things was remarkable.
And second part, Julia Grant, as I understand it, was the first lady to write her autobiography. I'm assuming she wrote it after his death.
Yeah.
And did
Yeah.
Mark Twain's publishing company publish it?
I don't think.
No, they didn't because it actually wasn't published until 1975. Believe it. But she did write it. Yeah, she was the first. And everything, as I was preparing for this, she was sort of a first lady's first lady. She loved the job, apparently. She loved being in the White House. She loved being all those duties and roles, hostess and all that. But she did write that, but I didn't see the light of day until 1975. So Mark Twain was long gone.
And to reinforce what Jeff said, when they were in a public setting at a state dinner or whatever, she really took the lead. She was a much bigger and more present personality than her husband was. And that was fine with him. He adored her. And so if she wants to be the one who's going to carry on the conversations and be the public persona, that was okay, because that was the nature of their relationship.
We've got to wrap up. Can we give one more round of applause for Jon and Jeffrey? One more thanks to Jon, and thank you to Jeffrey. One more shout out to the National Civil War Museum. If you have not attended the museum, make sure you get out there. Jeffrey has some cool stuff to show off, but we're also going to have a book signing here with Jon over at this table. Books are available for purchase up at the cafe. We also have a couple of Jon's other books up there if you'd like to get another one. But thanks again, and thank you everyone for coming out. Have a good night.